Hello, everyone, and welcome to a Eco-Investment update for the week of April 6, 2018. And, well, it has been another wild and woolly day in a wild and woolly week with reversals, volatility in the stock market, tariffs, talks of trade wars, slowing job growth. What's going on here? It's been a couple months since I've done one of these updates because, quite frankly, the script is pretty much followed along the way that I thought it would from months ago. Back in about 2 months ago, I appeared on TR Preppers Tuesday evening chats. And if you're not watching those chats, you really should be, because we cover economics, we cover politics, we cover investments, we cover prepping. I think that they're very, very excellent chats. Well, on that hangout about 2 months ago, I came armed with all sorts of charts and graphs showing the precarious state of the stock market at that time, and particularly its parabolic or almost straight up rise that had occurred since the election back in, well, when Trump got elected back in 2000, late 2016. The point was, you get to those parabolic sort of rises with no downswings, nothing to correct those rises. Well, they're generally symptomatic of moves that are reaching a climax and an end point. And, well, as Napoleon was once quipped to have said, you can do anything with a bayonet except sit on it. And he was exactly correct. You cannot stay on top of those points. What goes up must come down. And, well, inevitably we're, some 3,000 points lower on the Dow. And there's a lot of worry starting to appear in the marketplace today. My main theme, though, is, and I really expect this negative trend to continue, I think, but it may not be because of trade. Everybody's pointing the finger at tariffs. The United States raises tariffs on Chinese goods. The Chinese raise tariffs on U.S. goods, soybeans in the crosshairs now. Well, the problem with these trade wars is once they start, it's tit for tat, it's punch for punch, and really nobody is the loser. Nobody is the winner in these trade disputes for sure. The result is job loss, dislocations, and free trade. I agree with the president. Free trade should also be fair trade, but we have to be very careful how we accomplish that. And it's not just the stick; it's got to be a little bit of the carrot too. So consequently, there's been a lot of damage done to export stocks. Boeing, General Electric continues under pressure. United Technologies, there's been a lot of pressure. There's pressure being felt in the farm sector now with the prospect of reduced pork exports to China, reduced machinery exports to China, reduced soybean exports to China. Who knows where it'll end, you know? So I tell you, be very cautious. I'm still very negative on the market. We could have some rallies in here. It's even theoretically possible this all could bottom out and we can explode up to a new crazy new high with all types of speculative excesses unseen since the 1920s. But I don't think so. That was then, this is now. We had a very strong economy in the 1920s that became sort of honeycombed and like Swiss cheese late in the 1920s with margin lending on stocks and installment purchases on fancy new products like radios and ice boxes, appliances, labor saving devices. The problem was a lot of the people that purchased those sort of items really could not afford them, and they lived paycheck to paycheck by then. Well, we have a lot of similarities now, but we don't have the strength in the economy we used to have. We don't have the labor force that we had then. We have a large chunk of the labor force that's on disability today, or does not choose to work, or wants to pursue the so-called bohemian and simple life. Nothing wrong with that. That's just a choice that you make. That's fine. But unless we're all being productive and pushing on the same common wheel, well, it leaves more weight for other people to push. And sooner or later, a straw comes along that breaks the camel's back. And, well, there's not enough people working to sustain an expanding economy. There's just a bad brew of factors at work here. I also wanted to mention, and this is kind of the highlight in the title here today, that ironically, it's usually Republicans that kind of do dumb things over history economically, although they get credited a lot with prosperity. In a lot of ways, what they do tends to be counterproductive sometimes. Now, I'm not saying, to me, the real disastrous point in our economy was the election of 1932 and the New Deal. Because it brought about this idea that government now is responsibility for the success and prosperity of its citizens. Never before in the history of this country had that idea ever come to the fore. The assumption was the individual took care of his own needs, pursued his own interests, his own desires and dreams, and as a result, with everybody pursuing their own dreams, the machine functioned well, the free hands of the economy worked well, Adam Smith's so-called invisible hands, and everything functioned well. Well, the real tragedy of 1932 and that election of 32 was as the election was drawing nearer in late 1932, October of 1932, the stock market had already been in a very brisk recovery since bottoming in late June, early July of 1932. Bank failures had declined sharply, and Herbert Hoover, rightly or wrongly, always contended that it was Roosevelt's actions in not being cooperative during the interim period from election to assuming office. And that was a long one in those days, from November to March of the following year. December, January, February, March, 4 months, almost a third of a year before the president would assume office. Well, Roosevelt was very tight-lipped about what he was going to do, and did not want to cooperate with Hoover at all, coming to the conclusion that the worse Hoover's exit looked, the better his own would look coming in March of 1933. Well, it took a real toll on the economy that period, because all of a sudden, with fears of inflation and tinkering with the money supply and ideas about how to buy prosperity, people started getting a little nervous and started putting their money into gold. Withdrawals on banks increased, and the next thing you know, we had the enormous bank failures of early 1933, resulting in the shutting down of the banks nationwide for a bank holiday when Roosevelt took office in March. Then finally in April, the Gold Confiscation Act occurred. So, there's some truth to be said of Hoover's contention that, had things been allowed to go on along the path that they were going, recovery was already underway, because a strong wave of liquidation over years had provided a very firm foundation for an economy. It was no longer hollow and Swiss cheese. Now, what are the dumb ideas I'm talking about? Well, unbelievably, Herbert Hoover was President Calvin Coolidge's Commerce Secretary. Okay, and the last guy that you would think would support tariffs and things when he became president, he was all for the impositions of tariffs, thinking that it would aid the economy and help recovery. Well, the problem is we see that it created a tariff war in the 1930s. Let me read you an excerpt from Hoover's speech at the 1932 at Madison Square Garden on October 31st, the Halloween speech, just about 6 days before election in 1932. His claim, because Roosevelt wanted to remove the tariff, figuring it would stimulate trade. Well, here's the warning that Hoover gave. He said in a tirade, "With no tariff," Hoover warned, "the grass will grow in streets of 100 cities. 1,000 towns, the weeds will overrun the fields of millions of farms. Their churches and schoolhouses will decay." Well, as we know, that was hardly what came true, but we did introduce things like the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, under Henry Wallace, trying to set floor prices. Well, this is what I'm talking about, this whole parcel of the government getting involved in trying to create prosperity. on a national top-down level instead of on a bottom-up from the people level, like Hoover liked to do. He believed that the people were like individual cells in a sick patient, and wellness had to come from within when the bad was excised, and finally the good was able to overcome the bad, and the disease was licked. Well, it wasn't just Hoover that had bad ideas about things too as a Republican. Remember, Richard Nixon introduced the wage and price controls in the early to mid 1970s, which were basically kind of a disaster. It put a price lid on commodities, causing manufacturers, miners, producers to slow down their output of goods because they didn't feel like they were being properly rewarded, with prices being capped and difficulties of getting raw materials out of the ground with price caps on them. Well, when those price caps and wage and price controls were taken off later, we saw that inflation really boomed under Ford's administration until it finally was totally out of control by the time that Ronald Reagan took office. And Paul Volcker had to crush inflation by taking interest rates up to astronomical levels. Two Republican presidents, two real bad ideas. Now we come to President Trump with the tariffs and all that. Well, it could be a case of here we go again. We shall see. So it's not always the domain. Bad ideas aren't invented in one party or another. They probably equally come from both. Stay alert, stay sharp, and I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for being along.